Okay, Eric, we're live. Take it away.
Hi, thanks, Michelle. Thank you all for joining us, but especially thank you to the Rob Dunn Lab for assembling this wonderful series. I have enjoyed every weekend and intend to continue to participate. And my task, right, is to explain 6,000 years of sourdough history in 20 minutes. And obviously, that's not something that's going to happen. My goal here is to sort of skim the wave tops and pick out a few highlights from my forthcoming book called Sourdough Culture, The History and Science of Sourdough. That book, I'll explain why, is going to be out probably next summer. And so here are a few things that I picked up in my research on the history of sourdough. So anybody who's been part of this series or is making sourdough or has sourdough knows that to make sourdough bread, you really only need 4, maybe 3 ingredients. You need flour. You can make sourdough bread really with any flour, but if you want it to rise, and you need a flour that has gluten, and wheat flour is your best choice for that. You need some water. Of course, you can use any other liquid. Salt, you don't have to have it, but it certainly tastes better if you do. And then a leavening agent. And the remarkable thing is that for 6,000 years, until just about 200 years ago, the only leavening agent was this glop, this mess of flour and water. And unbeknownst to anybody until 200 years ago, a collection of wild yeast and bacteria. And we'll see in later presentations later on in this series, that the Rob Dunn Lab is, if you want to know how those bacteria and yeast have gotten in there, those are the people to talk to and to learn about. But until very recently, it was just glop, and that was the recipe that we used since pretty much the dawn of civilization until very recently. That you mix together flour and water and salt and some magic glop that you saved from the last time you baked, and you make something and repeat it, and you get bread. Very delicious and yummy bread. And it worked that way almost continuously from the dawn of the first settled civilizations, 6,000 years ago, until the Industrial Revolution, when we decided that we could fabricate bread in large, continuous operating machines. So what I want to talk about is sort of the very beginnings, and other people have talked about this in this series, that agriculture, the domestication of plants and animals, starts roughly all over the world about 10,000 years ago. We have really good archaeological evidence from the Middle East, partly because it's so dry and it's easy to preserve things in a very dry climate. But we see the very first time, starting around the end of the last ice age, 10,000 years ago, humans settling down and picking seeds and saving them, not just eating them, but saving them and replanting them, and then picking the biggest and the most nutritious and the tastiest seeds and replanting those again. And you start to develop a relationship between human beings and particular plants that they like. Now, most of those plants are grasses, and among those grasses are the forerunners of what we have as modern wheat and corn and emmer in particular. And again, a reminder, you can make bread from barley and from chickpeas and lentils, but if you do, because those things don't have gluten, you're going to get a brick or a flatbread. But if you want to get something that rises and holds its shape, you do need to use wheat or a forerunner of wheat. What's interesting is that about the same time that humans are domesticating wheat and beginning this relationship where one cares for the other, humans care for the wheat, and wheat in some respects cares for humans, we're also a couple of thousand years later developing a relationship with these microscopic organisms without ever knowing it. And so we can surmise, there's no way to really know who or when exactly this happened, but a porridge is left out. This is how the sourdough project works. You leave out a porridge of some grain and water. In 2 or 3 days, it will start bubbling. And if you take that and cook it, you'll also get some oven spring. You won't know why until 200 years ago when you have a pretty decent microscope. But you will get something that's reproducible, especially if you save some of that glop and use it next time. And so what we know is some of the earliest, most successful civilizations, let's go to ancient Egypt, really built their societies around growing wheat, harvesting wheat, grinding that wheat into flour, using that as the fuel to feed very large populations, that in the process, they were also domesticating or starting a relationship with microscopic yeast and bacteria that they were using to both leaven bread, and we know now the very same yeast species, Saccharomyces cerevisiae, and probably the same bacteria, could be used to eat the carbohydrates in a liquid form and grow beer. And with beer and bread, you could feed 10,000 pyramid workers, provide enough fuel and safe drinking water, fuel being the carbohydrates needed to keep a worker alive and functioning for another day of work, that we know from archaeological evidence that huge populations were supported with large bakeries of sourdough breads in ancient Egypt. What follows several thousand years of Egyptian civilization are the Greeks, followed by the Romans. And what's so interesting to me about Roman civilization is that the map of essentially the Roman Empire, which you see here in yellow, overlaps almost perfectly with the range in which you could grow wheat. So to the north of the yellow, which is no longer the Roman Empire, wheat doesn't grow. It's too cold, it's too wet, and doesn't really, it defines in some ways the edge of the Roman Empire. And so the Romans brought wheat from all over their empire to Rome, with which I'll talk about what they did with that wheat in a minute, but you can see somehow here is Hadrian's Wall in Great Britain. The border between what most traditional historians would describe as the border between the Scots to the north, who are barbaric people to the Romans, who were a danger to the Roman Empire, are to the north and the left of the wall, and the English and the Romans are to the right or the south of the wall. But that line is also the line between where wheat will no longer grow to the north in Scotland. It's too wet and too cold for wheat, but oats can deal. And so if you think of Scottish food, you think of Scottish oat cakes and Scottish oatmeal, but not a whole lot of bread in sort of traditional Scottish fare. Likewise, if you were to go north of the Roman Empire towards Germany, what's now Germany and Denmark and Scandinavia, you've moved from wheat territory to rye territory. Now, of course, sourdough rye is a wonderful, wonderful kind of bread, but it's not the same as Italian bread or what the Romans would have eaten. So what the Romans did is they transported grain from all over their empire to Rome, which they then distributed to free male citizens in the form of bread. And as the Roman philosopher said in chastising the Roman government, that basically the Roman government is just pacifying people by giving them free bread and circuses, entertainment, so that they don't revolt. The theory being much the same as today, that if you give 18 to 21-year-old men enough pizza and beer and football on Sundays, they won't revolt either. That's sort of what Juvenal was saying. It doesn't hold entirely true, because at the very, very far edge of the eastern edge of the Roman Empire, there is a young man, Jesus of Bethlehem, Bethlehem being in Hebrew, bet, house, lechem being bread, the house of bread, who is not fond of the Roman occupation of the Middle East and of their way of dealing with things. And here, again, just if you want the details, you're going to have to read the book, but think about Jesus of Bethlehem or Nazareth. And his very first miracle, the miracle that is attributed to him by all four books of the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, is the miracle of the fishes and the loaves, where he feeds thousands of people with 5 loaves of bread. And anybody who knows sourdough, as everybody at the time would have, knows that sourdough can grow and reproduce and feed thousands and thousands of people if it is nourished correctly. Take it a step further, and you'll see that Jesus, as most people know, at the Last Supper declares what? That my body is bread. But as everybody would have known at the time, his body would have been sourdough bread. And that thought of the bubbling pot of sourdough and the smell and the feeling of warm bread would have been both satisfying physically as well as spiritually to anybody who made that association at the time. And so he didn't have to say my body is sourdough bread, but he would have, everyone would have known it at the time. Everybody at the time also would have known that sourdough cultures have essentially eternal life. And as Peter Reinhardt said in his presentation a couple of weeks ago, think about it this way, that no other form, right? Jesus Christ could have said, my body is a stone, or he could have said, I'm a lamb, or any other thing, but he chose fermentation. My body is bread, my blood is wine. And here's one more thing that might have gone through the minds of people at the time, that wheat is alive, flour is dead, it is brought back to life by association with sourdough culture, only to die again in the oven, and finally to bring life again as we break bread, that it is our sustenance and has been our sustenance and will continue to be our sustenance in the form of bread. And this is not totally my idea, but the Eastern Orthodox Church does the Eucharist, the delivery of the body of Christ, using a sourdough that their scriptures describe as having come from the very blood and tears of Christ on the cross, that those were captured by John, who then made a sourdough starter from it, and that sourdough starter is still in use in the churches of sort of Syria, northern Iraq, and so forth by the Eastern Orthodox churches. All right, moving ahead. That sourdough bread now after the fall of the Roman Empire, for the next several, really 1,000 years, several centuries, is going to be the difference between famine and survival across the Middle Ages. As I did my research, much of what I learned about the mythology of sourdough turned out to be exactly that, mythology, not entirely true. This is a Bruegel painting of the harvesting of the wheat during the Middle Ages, when in fact the harvesting of the wheat was controlled by the landlord, the lord of the manor, who forced serfs to not just harvest wheat, but to donate very large portions of it, both to the lord of the manor and to the church as tithes. And the only way a serf did survive was by having a sourdough starter and hoping to have just enough flour, which was milled by the miller, who was controlled by the lord of the manor, and baked in a communal oven by a baker who worked for the lord of the manor, and hope that those guys were scrupulous enough to be fair in their dealings. It was a very touch and go situation, and remained so from the fall of the Roman Empire until through the French Revolution, when you really have a failure of bread and circuses to keep the population pacified. What happens in the French Revolution, among many other things, is that the price of a sourdough baguette got to be too expensive. And what you have when bread gets too expensive, and there's a long history of the price of bread going up and a government coming down, is a revolution. And here is perhaps the most famous revolutionary phrase ever uttered by, in this case, Marie Antoinette, right, who said, if the people don't have bread, let them eat cake. She actually said brioche, which anybody who's had one is not that different from a very nice cake. The unfortunate thing is Marie Antoinette never said this. She never would have said it. Again, you can learn why when the book finally comes out, but it was attributed to her sort of 50 years after the revolution, when revolutionaries wanted to pin on her the cause of the revolution. Anybody who remembers the French Revolution or knows about the French Revolution, that Marie Antoinette and her husband, King Louis XVI, went the same way as this baguette. Their heads were taken off by a bread guillotine or its equivalent soon after they were captured. I told you this was quick. We have 20 minutes to do 6,000 years. Here we are up into the 1600s when Antoine van Leeuwenhoek he's just a really good microscope maker. And he in the 1600s is the first time he's putting things underneath a microscope, and everything he can find, he puts underneath a microscope. He doesn't know what he's seeing in 1600. He calls these little tiny things animalcules. He doesn't know if they're animals or vegetables or alive or not alive. He just knows that nobody has ever seen them before. But up till now, blood was a liquid, but now it turns out it's made of these little cells. And there are cells and there are red cells. And then it turns out he can discover yeast cells and bacteria cells and sperm cells. And I will very quickly go on while you ponder how he got sperm cells onto his microscope slide. But it's going to be 200 years of really intense experimentation before Louis Pasteur finally brings together all of the science to figure out that yeast are in fact alive, that they reproduce, and that as waste products of consuming carbohydrates, that they produce carbon dioxide and alcohol, which we know today carbonate beer, ferment beer, make bread rise, and so forth. But we're now into the late 1800s. Along the way, Great Britain is about to destroy what we consider to be good bread. The Industrial Revolution changes everything. The Industrial Revolution really gets going in the 1700s, so the Manchester area, Lancashire area of northern England. And the thought being that if we can change fabrication or mechanism by mechanizing the production of textiles and move it from a spinning wheel managed by a single woman in her house, making a single line of thread, but can put it onto a machine that could do very large swashes of fabric or textiles, we could do that for fabric. Why couldn't we do that for anything? And so the whole idea of mass production becomes a concept that bread makers and all kinds of food producers are going to apply or transfer from the Industrial Revolution to this. And we're going to need a couple of things. We're going to need good quality yeast. And now that Louis Pasteur has figured out what yeast is, there are hundreds of patents being developed all over the world in the 19th century for ways to produce pretty clear, pretty clean yeast, no bacteria allowed, that works really quickly and makes bread rise very fast. And you're going to need thousands of loaves of bread to feed thousands of workers who are now moving from farms to textile mills. And we're going to see the death of sourdough. And so it's going to be displaced by rapidly produced, fast-growing yeast and rapidly produced, quickly manufactured bread. And the last redoubt of sourdough are these guys. These are miners, right, who are mythologized as the guys who were sourdoughs who went out for the gold rush of 1849 in San Francisco, to the Klondike gold rush of Alaska. I actually have a sourdough starter from the Cripple Creek gold rush of 1893. And these guys were independent, who supposedly survived on nothing more than a sourdough starter they kept close to their hearts, and a pan and a shovel and maybe a tent. And that whole mythology was sort of really cemented in the minds of most people around the world by Jack London, the author, who wrote a couple of books who really celebrating the independence of that lone miner out there in the Alaskan wilderness or the top of the Colorado Rockies or wherever. It turns out none of that is really true either. Yes, there were probably a couple of people who really did survive that way. But if you think about how mines operate and were operating in the 19th century at the height of the Gilded Era, and this is as true in North America as it is in Australia or South America, mines were owned by very, very wealthy capitalists who employed thousands of day laborers and paid them $2 a day for 10 hours of work. They took that $2 and they didn't live in tents. They went to the bakery. They spent it at hotels for lodging. They weren't making their own food. These guys didn't know how to cook anyway. And that's probably closer to the real story with respect to sourdough. There are some sourdoughs left from those eras, but they're not the myth that Jack London made. So 1960s, we have the Chorleywood bread process. This is just continuous, essentially no knead, no time dough running through machines comes in. Again, the British invent this. We transform dough from a very slow, methodical process that depends upon the slow actions of wild yeast and bacteria. And you can see on the left, how many ingredients are necessary to make the dough fit the large machines and survive the large machines that are needed to create very quick bread. You can see that Americans are even better at adding more ingredients to their bread to make their machines, which are even larger, turn out bread very quickly. So as I summarize, I'm almost at the end of 6,000 years. I guess I'd like to make the case that even if you are one of the people who just made a sourdough last week or 2 weeks ago as part of Lauren and Aaron's experiment about making your sourdough, and your sourdough starter is not 125 years old like mine is, but is a couple of days old, it does, in my opinion, still contain the history of humanity, that our survival as Western civilization is embodied in these sourdough cultures. And this is my own personal mission. I believe sourdough starters, like love and like bread, are to be shared and given away, and that there's no better feeling for you or for a recipient than to break bread with that person. In these times, when spending 20 minutes doing a YouTube video on sourdough bread, in some ways feels superfluous. I can think of this is one small way to make a contribution, is to understand the breads of different cultures, see what kinds of breads other people are eating, share bread with those people, share your sourdough experience with those people, and let's work on rebuilding our sense of community and justice. Here's how I share my sourdough. I put it into these little containers and smuggle them past TSA and bring them all over the world, where I share them, or now I mail dried versions of my old starters. Here's some of the places. This is a slightly outdated map, but you can see my Cripple Creek, Colorado Gold Rush starter from 1893 is pretty much on every continent but Australia. And it's a kind of fungal network that spans the globe. And that's it. The reason the book is not out till next year is because COVID shut down the publishing industry, and the original plan to publish this fall has been postponed a year and will be out sometime next summer or fall. And probably once again, Michelle will say, I'm sorry, we don't have any time for questions. If you have any questions or want to be put on an email list for when I do have an announcement that the book is available, send me an email at that email address. Michelle, I'm done.
Well done, Eric. Thank you so much. I mean, we all came for the history of sourdough, but I'm so glad to be leaving with the skills of sneaking sourdough past TSA. And in the chat on YouTube, you have a very happy recipient willing in New Zealand, if you ever make it.
Excellent. Good. I need to get it there.
So I want to thank everybody again. Thank you, Eric, for lending your expertise. I do have a quick schedule note for next week. It was going to be Ann Madden's talk. If you RSVP'd maybe about a month ago or earlier, it was Ann, but we're changing the talks around. It's actually going to be Rob. Rob Dunn is going to be conversing with the Vanessa Kimball, who's a famous sourdough baker based in the UK. That's not going to be on Zoom and it's not going to be on YouTube. It's actually going to be on the Sourdough Club Instagram. So if you look up the Sourdough Club and like them, you'll be ready for the talk next week. And also a different change, because she's based in the UK, the time is going to be at 10 a.m. and not 4 p.m. at night, 10 a.m. instead of 4. So keep that in mind. And again, if you have any questions for Eric, there's his contact information. And thank you all for showing up again this week. And hopefully we'll see you next week on Instagram. So thanks, Eric.